Tonight, we begin with something quieter, something smaller than we usually imagine. We're stepping into ancient hills, not into the roar of armies, but into the spaces in between, the quiet valleys where courage first takes root. This isn't the story of a champion carved in stone. It's the story of a boy who carried bread to his brothers, a boy who listened to the wind more than the weapons, a boy who stepped forward, not with armor, but with presence. So, before we wander too deep into the valley, take a second to like the video only if slow. Sacred storytelling is your kind of thing. If it helps your mind settle, if it gives your heart space to breathe, subscribe. And in the comments, tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? It's always beautiful to see this quiet little space stretch across the world. Now close your eyes and walk with me into the hills of Judah, where courage blooms not in noise, but in the soft, steady steps of a shepherd boy. The hills of Judah stretched wide beneath the pale sweep of dawn, the muted gold of the morning sun curling gently along the slopes, pressing faint warmth into the earth as shadows stretched long across the fields. And in the spaces between those shadows, the quiet hum of life unfolded, steady and unhurried, the flocks grazing along the hillsides, their forms scattered like small moving clouds against the rocky terrain, their bleats soft beneath the weight of a world that seemed, for this moment, to care little for thrones or armies, for the roaring pride of men who believe their words alone shape the earth. And among those hills, his footsteps pressed quiet into the grass, his sandals worn, his tunic brushed with the dust of mourning, his shoulders carrying not the weight of lineage, not the heavy drape of royal fabric or the polished gleam of weapons, but the simple, steady ache of tending, of walking the same ridges each day, of guiding the sheep beneath the shifting sky. His name, David, spoken softly by those who knew him, by brothers who called him the youngest, the smallest, the afterthought trailing behind the sharper edges of the family's legacy. But here, in the hills, beyond the noise of expectation, beyond the tangled pride of men, he moved without the weight of their eyes, his hands steady as they guided the flock, his gaze trailing the horizon where the earth bent wide beneath the hum of creation, the fields whispering of ancient stories, of ancestors who once pressed their feet into the same soil, who once carried the same quiet questions beneath their breath, wondering whether the God of their fathers still saw, still moved, still shaped the small corners of the world unnoticed by kings. David walked with the rhythm of the hills, his sling coiled at his side, not for show, not for spectacle, but for the wolves, the lions that sometimes pressed too near, their forms hidden in the underbrush, their hunger woven into the edges of the wilderness. And though the fields whispered of peace, they also pulsed with the raw, unspoken ache of survival, of defending what is small, of standing steady in the quiet spaces between the roars of the world. And so he learned, not in palaces or courts, but in the slow unfolding of days, in the steady ache of guiding sheep, in the soft crack of stones loosed from his sling, in the hum of songs whispered to the hills when no one else listened, the songs braided from old psalms, from the promises of a God who speaks not always in thunder, but in the hush of wind pressing through the olive trees, in the steady drip of rain against parched soil, in the quiet courage threaded through the life of a boy unseen by the world, yet shaped by the steady presence that lingers when no one else watches. And beneath the stretch of sky, as the sun climbed higher, as the sheep pressed their bodies against the earth to rest, David knelt beside the stream that wove like a silver thread through the hills, his fingers curling into the cool water, his reflection rippling faint upon the surface, and within his chest the quiet hum of something more stirred, not ambition, not the sharp ache of proving himself, but the slow, sacred knowing that courage often blooms far from the roar of armies, far from the clang of weapons, far from the polished pride of kings, here, in the forgotten spaces, in the fields where sheep wander, where stones lie smooth beneath the stream, where a young shepherd carries nothing but his sling, his songs, and the quiet, unwavering presence of a God who sees, who shapes, who calls even the smallest heart toward a story the world has yet to notice. The valley stretched wide beneath the pale sweep of morning, the sun curling faint along the distant ridges, its warmth pressing gently into the stone as the earth held its breath, and across the valley floor, still untouched by war, the faint echo of a voice threaded through the air, loud, sharp, layered with both cruelty and brittle pride, the sound carrying like distant thunder pressed low to the ground, and the men of Israel stood still upon the ridge, their shoulders tight, their breaths uneven as the weight of Goliath's words curled around them, as his defiance unraveled across the open space like a storm yet to break. The giant's form pressed tall upon the opposite slope, his armor gleaming faint in the sun, his spear sharp as a weaver's beam gripped steady in his palm, his laughter sharp beneath the hum of fear braided through both armies, his voice coiled with mockery as he called once more across the distance, daring them to answer, to step forward, to meet him not with armies, not with numbers, but with a single man brave enough to stand alone upon the soil they all called holy. And yet none moved, none stepped beyond the line, their courage bending beneath the weight of his shadow. For Goliath was no ordinary warrior. His height carved him apart, his frame broad and towering above the gathered soldiers, his face worn by years of battle, his confidence shaped by victories that had fractured the resolve of lesser men. And now, day after day, he rose with the sun, his voice echoing through the valley like a curse that lingered long after the sound had died, his threats pressing sharp into the hearts of Israel's fighters, their knees trembling beneath their armor, their eyes falling from the horizon. And across the slope, the Philistine army stood watchful, their smirks threaded with brittle confidence, their swords gleaming with the false certainty that the roar of one man could silence the faith of an entire nation. And still, the valley remained quiet, the battle unfought, the fear thickening like smoke among the ranks. And upon the ridge, Saul watched, his crown pressing heavy against his brow, his shoulders hunched with the weight of authority that now unraveled beneath him, his spirit aching with the slow, undeniable fracture of his resolve. For though he was king, though his name carried the hum of history, the presence that once steadied him now felt distant, faint, tucked beyond the clouds that stretched wide above the battlefield. And Goliath's voice filled the space where faith should have lingered, where courage should have bloomed. And still, no one stepped forward, no one answered, no one dared to believe that the God who parted seas, who carved promises into desert stone, still whispered to the hills, still called the forgotten to rise. And beyond the valley, upon the distant hills, where the sheep grazed quiet and unnoticed, a young shepherd pressed his footsteps into the earth, unaware of the noise awaiting him, his sling coiled at his side, his eyes tracing the sky, where the clouds stretched soft and unbroken, his spirit steady not because he sought a throne, not because he chased after the roar of kings, but because the fields had taught him the quiet, steady hum of courage, braided not from pride, but from presence. And though the giant's voice thundered across the land, though the armies trembled beneath its weight, the hills carried their own song, the whisper of a shepherd, the quiet ache of courage yet to unfold, the presence of a God who sees beyond size, beyond armor, beyond the brittle roar of fear. The morning pressed soft against the hills, the light curling along the ridges of Judah, the faint hum of wind threading through the tall grasses, whispering of stories hidden beyond the rise of stone. And across the slope, David walked, his footsteps steady along the familiar paths, his sling coiled at his side, his tunic brushed with dust from the fields, his arms carrying the simple weight of bread, of provisions wrapped gently in cloth, sent not as a warrior, not as a messenger of kings, but as a boy with quiet hands, a younger brother bringing food to the camp where his siblings waited, their voices carried faint upon the wind, layered with both pride and the brittle edge of fear. And as he moved, the fields stretched wide around him, the sheep grazing upon the slopes, their bodies pressing low to the earth, their presence familiar, anchoring him to the rhythm of quieter days spent beneath the unbroken sky. Yet today, the hum of the land carried something different, a quiet ache beneath the breeze, the faint pulse of tension braided into the air, the sense that beyond the next rise, the world pressed sharper, heavier, layered with noise unfamiliar to the hills. And so David walked, his eyes tracing the horizon, unaware of how the hours ahead would fracture his story, how the fields of sheep and the songs of quiet mornings would give way to the roar of armies and the sharp hum of confrontation. The provisions tucked beneath his arms carried not only bread, but the silent thread of purpose unfolding beyond his knowing. And as he approached the camp, the distant murmur of soldiers grew louder, their voices sharp with anxiety, their feet pressing restless into the dirt, their armor catching the light in glinting fragments, the banners of Israel fluttering weakly along the ridge, their edges tattered by the wind. And within the camp, his brothers moved, their faces drawn with the quiet weight of waiting, their eyes flickering between the rocky slopes and the wide valley that stretched below. And as David stepped near, the noise sharpened, the low hum of fear braided through pride, the uncertainty that presses deep when courage falters, the whispers of men layered with questions unspoken aloud. And yet David's presence unraveled differently, his spirit untouched by the heavy silence of the valley, his hands carrying the simple ache of care, of small offerings sent from home, his heart steady not from pride, but from the quiet knowing braided into years spent tending flocks, listening to the hum of creation, hearing the presence of the God who whispers not only from mountains and fire, but from the steady rustle of wind through the trees, from the stillness of fields yet untouched by the noise of kings. And now, as the camp shifted around him, as the soldiers turned, as his brothers lifted their eyes in recognition, the ache of the valley unfolded before him, the wide stretch of earth dividing the armies, the towering form of Goliath pressing against the horizon, his voice curling sharp through the air. And David, bread still tucked beneath his arm, stepped into the camp, not as a warrior, but as a quiet witness to the unfolding fracture of fear and courage braided across the valley floor. The noise pressed heavy across the camp, a low hum braided with the sharp edges of fear and pride, the clatter of armor shifting, the brittle laughter of men layered with uncertainty, their eyes darting between the rocky slopes and the wide valley stretched before them. And still, David stood quiet among them, his presence threaded into the spaces they overlooked, unnoticed by many, his feet pressed firm into the earth, his gaze steady as it lingered upon the valley floor, upon the distant form of the giant whose shadow stretched wide across the land, Goliath's voice rising once more, curling sharp through the air, heavy with mockery, layered with the brittle confidence of one convinced his roar alone can fracture the resolve of those who listen. And yet David did not flinch, his eyes tracing the lines of the earth, the gentle bend of the hills, the steady hum of the fields beyond the noise of men, beyond the thunder of defiance pressed sharp from the Philistine camp. His heart beat slow, steady beneath his tunic, his hands unburdened by sword or shield, his spirit anchored not in the noise of power, but in the quiet presence woven through the hills, through the ancient song of stone and soil that whispered still beneath the roar of kings. And as the soldiers around him spoke sharp of fear, of uncertainty, of the weight of a warrior none dared to challenge, David listened, not to the noise that cracked brittle through the camp, but to the ache beneath it, to the hollow spaces between their words, to the fractures of courage braided into their voices, to the quiet absence where faith once lingered, their faces drawn with the ache of forgotten promises, their breath heavy with the weight of a God they now feared had fallen silent. And yet the hills hummed still, the valley held its breath. The God who weaves courage unseen moves steady through the spaces unnoticed by men, through the soil pressed beneath their feet, through the wind curling faint across the ridges, through the stillness that often precedes the unraveling of fear. And David, small among them, youngest, unburdened by the pride of title, listened, his spirit steady, his breath braided with the quiet ache of courage that blooms not in the roar of armies, but in the stillness of those who see beyond the noise, beyond the brittle pride of kings, beyond the sharpened edges of giants who believe their voice shapes history. The valley waited, the camp trembled, but David listened. Before speaking, before stepping, before the first stone would leave his sling, he listened to the presence that never wavers, to the hum of a God who speaks loudest in the quiet. The sun pressed higher over the valley as the morning deepened, its pale warmth stretching along the ridges where two armies lingered in silence that was heavy but brittle, the kind of quiet that hums with tension just beneath the surface. And along the ridge of Israel, the soldiers stood, their bodies layered in armor, their eyes darting across the valley floor where the shadow of the giant stretched long like a crack across the earth. Goliath's figure unmoving for now, but his words still curling through the air, laced with mockery and defiance, their echoes pressing sharp into the bones of men who had once called themselves warriors, their confidence unraveling beneath the weight of a fear that spread not like fire, but like a quiet ripple across still water, subtle at first, unseen, but steady, relentless, until even the strongest among them felt it pulling at the edges of their resolve, their hands trembling faint against the hilts of swords, their feet rooted not in courage, but in hesitation braided with uncertainty. And in that ripple, in the silent ache of fear folding through the camp, the strength of an entire army began to erode, not with battle, not with the clash of swords upon shields, but with the quiet, unspoken fracture of hearts that once believed themselves strong. And as David stood among them, his eyes tracing the lines of the valley, his spirit steady, his breath slow, he saw it, not with arrogance, not with the brittle pride of one who believes himself above the ache, but with the quiet awareness braided into years spent upon the hills, listening to the hum of the earth, to the stillness between storms, to the presence of the God who speaks not through the roar of men, but through the spaces they forget to notice. And now, that same presence threaded through the camp, unseen but near, steady as the soil beneath their feet, as the valley floor that waited unbroken for courage to bloom. And David watched as the ripple of fear deepened, as the strongest voices among them faltered, as even Saul, their king, stood quiet, his shoulders heavy with the weight of pride unraveling beneath the shadow of a single man. the giant whose name now braided itself through their stories like a fracture unhealed. And still, the camp pressed in on itself, their courage folding, their resolve eroding beneath the ripple of fear that spread, not with sound, but with the heavy absence of faith, of presence. And David, youngest among them, unnoticed still, carried the quiet knowing that armies do not always fall by the sword. They collapse beneath the weight of forgetting who holds the valleys, who speaks beneath the shadows, who weaves courage steady beneath the roar of fear, the God who never leaves even when men falter, even when armies forget how to stand. The noise of the camp pressed sharp around him, voices layered with brittle pride, with the tight ache of fear disguised beneath words that stumbled over themselves, soldiers shifting restless beneath the glare of the sun, their armor gleaming faint, but their shoulders sagging beneath the unseen weight of uncertainty. And David stood among them, his frame small, his presence unnoticed still by most, his hands empty save for the bread once meant for his brothers, now forgotten beneath the hum of tension that curled through the air like smoke. And yet, as his eyes traced the lines of the valley floor, as his gaze lingered upon the wide open space that divided the trembling of men from the brittle roar of their enemy, he saw what others could not with arrogance, not with the pride of one who believes his name will echo louder than the rest, but with the quiet, steady clarity braided into years spent upon the hills, watching sheep graze slow beneath the hum of an unbroken sky, listening to the wind curl soft along the slopes, hearing the presence of a God who whispers, not in the roar of kings, but in the hush of small places where courage grows unseen. And now, in the shadow of armies, in the fracture that divided hope from fear, David saw it again. The quiet ache of courage braided beneath the noise, pulsing steady even as the soldiers faltered, even as their words tangled with doubt, even as Goliath's voice pressed sharp across the valley, curling loud with defiance, with mockery, with the brittle confidence of one who believes size alone shapes history. And still, David watched, his spirit anchored not by the noise, but by the quiet hum of presence threaded through the soil beneath his feet, by the memory of lions and bears pressed too close to the flock, their teeth sharp, their roar loud, their threat undeniable, yet each time met not with fear alone, but with the steady hand of one who knows courage does not bloom from size, but from presence, from the God who weaves strength into the overlooked, into the smallest hearts, into the quiet ache of those who stand when others fold. And now, as the sun pressed higher, as the camp bent beneath the weight of fear, David saw beyond the noise, beyond the sharpened edges of pride and threat, beyond the brittle roar of giants, to the still sacred space where courage waits, unseen but near, steady as the hills, ancient as the stories whispered to the fields when no one else listens. And his spirit did not falter, his breath did not catch, for the God who speaks beneath the noise had never stopped watching, never stopped weaving, never stopped threading courage beneath the hum of forgotten spaces, where boys become men, not through throne or crown, but through quiet steps into the unknown. The valley stretched wide beneath the press of late morning, the sun curling along the ridges, the earth humming with the ache of unfinished stories woven into the soil. And David stood quiet, his hands resting at his side, the familiar weight of his sling coiled near, worn smooth by years of use, by countless days spent upon the hills where the sheep wandered beneath the open sky, far from the roar of armies, far from the brittle pride of kings. And as the noise of the camp swirled sharp around him, as the soldiers spoke of fear, of giants, of battles they dared not fight, David's thoughts pressed steady to the hills, to the quiet spaces where courage first took root, not shaped by the noise of men, but by the hum of presence threaded through the forgotten corners of the earth. The God who speaks in silence, who weaves strength not through spectacle, but through the steady ache of tending, of defending, of standing against the shadows that slip too close to the flock. And David remembered the nights when the wind curled sharp across the ridges, when the lions pressed near, their forms hidden beneath the dark, their breath heavy upon the still air, their hunger sharp as teeth that waited to fracture the calm. And yet, even then, his hands were never empty, not because they carried swords, not because they wielded the armor of men, but because they carried the quiet tools of the fields, the staff worn smooth beneath his palm, the sling that nestled into the curve of his hand, the stones gathered from the stream, their surfaces cool, their presence small but steady. And when the lions roared, when the bears crept close, his heart did not falter. His spirit did not fracture beneath the weight of fear, for the God who threads courage into the small and overlooked moved with him, unshaken, unseen, steady as the hills themselves, and now beneath the wide gaze of an army folding upon itself, beneath the brittle roar of a giant convinced his voice alone can shape the earth, David remembered the fields, the quiet ache of courage learned when no one watched, the strength braided into his bones, not by crown or name, but by presence, by the God who never leaves, who never forgets, who never measures by size, by noise, by polished pride. And as his hand pressed gently against the sling at his side, familiar, worn, ready, his heart carried the hum of those hills still, unbroken, unmoved by the roar waiting across the valley floor. The noise pressed heavy across the camp, the brittle murmur of soldiers layered with the sharp edge of fear disguised as bravado, their voices cracking beneath the weight of uncertainty as they spoke of giants, of kings, of weapons forged in the fires of men who believe the roar of metal can silence the ache of inadequacy. And through that noise, through the restless hum of pride and trembling, David walked, his footsteps quiet but steady upon the earth, the hum of the hills pressed still into his bones, the memory of fields untouched by the brittle roar of armies anchoring his spirit. And though the soldiers barely noticed him, though his presence carried no weight in the eyes of men shaped by titles, by lineage, by the brittle scaffolding of thrones that rise and crumble beneath the weight of forgotten promises, his heart pulsed with something older, something quieter, the hum of presence, of the God who threads strength into the overlooked, into the spaces where courage blooms not from noise, but from nearness. And as the whispers wove through the camp, as the shadow of the giant stretched long across the valley floor, David was brought before Saul, the king whose crown gleamed faint beneath the sun, whose shoulders sagged beneath the ache of a calling grown brittle with distance, his eyes drawn and layered with the quiet fracture of faith slipping through his grasp. And when David spoke, his voice steady, unshaken, braided not with arrogance, but with the quiet, fierce clarity of one shaped by fields, by lions and bears, by the God who speaks in stillness, Saul listened, his gaze narrowing as the boy before him spoke not of thrones, but of tending, not of swords, but of small victories woven through forgotten hills. And though doubt lingered sharp upon the edges of his expression, Saul moved, calling forth his armor. The weight of bronze and polished leather pressed heavy into David's arms, the sword large and gleaming, the breastplate worn by battles shaped in fear, the helmet cool against his brow. And as they draped the king's weapons upon him, the brittle pride of men layering his small frame, David stood quiet, the unfamiliar ache of borrowed strength pressing sharp against his ribs. the armor shifting heavy upon his shoulders, the sword unwieldy beneath his grip. And in that moment, beneath the brittle scaffolding of human defenses, he remembered the hills, the fields, the lions, the presence that steadied him, not through weapons forged by men, but through the quiet hum of God threading strength into the overlooked. And he stepped back, his hands lifting the armor from his body, the polished pride of kings falling to the ground with a dull thud, the sword pressed aside, the breastplate discarded, the helmet removed. And as the soldiers watched, their expressions twisted with disbelief, with confusion. David straightened, his frame small, his spirit unburdened, his hands curling once more around the familiar coil of his sling, the memory of stones cool beneath his fingers, the presence steady upon the soil beneath his feet. And though the world offered him weapons sharpened by fear, defenses layered with noise, he chose the quiet tools of the fields, the strength braided through faith, the courage threaded not through armor, but through the nearness of a God who never leaves, never forgets, never measures victory by the brittle roar of kings. The stream curled quiet along the valley floor, its waters cool beneath the stretch of sun that pressed soft against the rocks, threading through the grasses that bent low beneath the weight of history, lingering across the soil. And David knelt there, his hands dipping into the current, his fingers brushing along the stones scattered beneath the surface, their edges worn smooth by time, by the endless rhythm of water pressing steady against them. And as his palm closed around the first stone, the cool surface fitting familiar into his grasp, his spirit hummed with the quiet ache of memory, of fields far from the brittle roar of kings, of hills stretched wide beneath skies unbroken by the noise of men who believe strength blooms only in the loudness of thrones. And he traced the curve of the stone, its surface small, unmeasured by the standards of soldiers, whose hands reached always for swords, for shields, for polished bronze that gleams beneath the sun, but fractures beneath the quiet weight of presence. And he gathered 4 more, each one chosen with care, with the steady awareness braided through years spent upon the hills, guiding sheep, pressing his footsteps into soil untouched by armor, by decree, by the brittle scaffolding of pride that kings build high and watch crumble beneath their own forgetting. And now, here, beneath the gaze of armies, beneath the long shadow of the giant who roared across the valley, David's hands filled not with the weapons of men, but with the stones shaped by water, by time, by the God who weaves strength through the overlooked, who threads courage into what fits quietly within the palm. And as he stood, the stones tucked into the leather pouch at his side, the sling resting easy against his hand, his heart did not falter, his spirit unburdened by the noise pressing brittle from the slopes, from the soldiers who watched in disbelief, their eyes tangled with fear, their words fracturing beneath the ache of witnessing a boy step forward with nothing but the tools of a shepherd, with the hum of presence braided steady into his bones. And the valley waited, the soil unbroken still, but the air thick with the tension of unfinished story, of a moment that does not belong to the roar of giants, but to the quiet hands that gather stones, that stand upon soil heavy with promise, that remember strength is not measured by the weight of armor, but by the steady hum of the God who threads deliverance into small, unpolished things that fit easily within the curve of a hand. The valley stretched wide before him, the soil pressed dry and cracked beneath the weight of history lingering silent upon the earth, the grasses bending faint in the breeze that hummed low across the open space. And David stood still upon the ridge, the stones cool within the pouch at his side, the familiar weight of his sling coiled easy against his hand, his breath slow beneath the hum of tension that threaded sharp through the air and beyond the silence, beyond the brittle noise of soldiers shifting restless upon the slopes. The giant waited. His shadow stretched long across the ground, his armor gleaming faint beneath the sun, his frame towering, unmoving, his presence braided with the brittle roar of pride that believes size alone can fracture courage. That noise alone can claim victory, and yet the earth held its breath. The wide valley floor pressed quiet with the hum of unfinished stories, of promises whispered to the fields beneath the watch of skies that have seen kingdoms rise and fall. And in that stillness, before the first step pressed into the soil, before the hum of presence unraveled across the open space, David stood rooted not by fear, not by the heavy ache of uncertainty that cracked through the ranks behind him, but by the steady hum of memory, of fields beyond the noise, of the God who threads courage into small, overlooked hearts, who shapes strength not through spectacle, but through the quiet ache of those who listen when the world forgets how. And though the soldiers' voices tangled behind him, layered with disbelief, with the sharp edge of fear disguised as doubt, as pride, as brittle words meant to shield trembling bones, David's spirit remained unburdened, anchored not by the roar of men, but by the presence braided into the soil beneath his feet, by the hum of the hills that taught him to listen, to stand, to trust the God who speaks not always in thunder, but in the hush of spaces where courage grows. And as he lifted his gaze across the valley, as his eyes traced the lines of the earth that curved wide between him and the giant, the silence pressed thicker, ancient, sacred, the space between words, between noise, where the first step would echo, not as rebellion, not as arrogance, but as obedience, as faith anchored to the presence that never leaves. And in that quiet, David moved, his foot pressing steady into the soil, his stride small but certain, his spirit layered with the hum of presence, with the steady ache of courage that blooms first in silence, in stillness, in the sacred pause before the world sees what the hills have always known. That deliverance begins not with the roar of armies, but with the quiet step of one who listens. The valley narrowed with each stride, the soil pressed dry beneath David's feet, the hum of the hills braided into his steps, the wide sky arched high above, unmoved by the roar of men, and across the open space, the giant's voice carried, sharp, brittle beneath its volume, the words curling with mockery, with the brittle defiance of one who believes size and sound alone carved the world into submission. And the soldiers of Israel watched, their breath caught in their chests, their eyes wide upon the impossible unfolding before them, their hands pressed trembling to their weapons, though none stepped forward, though none dared believe courage could still rise among them. Yet David pressed onward, his spirit layered not with pride, but with the hum of presence, with the steady ache of years spent upon the hills, where strength is not measured by height or blade, but by the quiet knowing that the God who threads courage into the overlooked remains, steady, unmoved, shaping stories in the spaces the world forgets to name as sacred. And as David neared, the giant loomed larger, his frame broad, his armor polished with the pride of victories worn across the brittle scaffold of fear, his laugh slicing sharp through the valley, his eyes narrowing upon the shepherd who approached not with sword, not with shield, but with the quiet, steady tools of fields beyond the noise, the sling coiled loose at his side, the stones nestled small in his pouch. And David's breath did not falter, his gaze did not lower, for the hills had taught him presence speaks louder than noise. Courage threads steady beneath the roar. And as he stood within the giant's shadow, within the fracture of pride layered in polished bronze, David spoke, his words unfolding not with spectacle, but with the quiet hum of truth anchored deep. You come to me with sword, with spear, with the brittle edges of pride shaped by the hands of men. But I come to you in the name of the Lord, the God, who does not measure by size, who does not bow beneath noise, who threads victory through the quiet courage of those the world overlooks. And though the soldiers behind him murmured sharp with disbelief, with fear coiling into their bones, David's voice remained steady, layered with the hum of presence, with the quiet ache of knowing that deliverance moves not through the roar of kings, but through the steady steps of one who listens. And the valley held its breath, the soil soaked with the ache of unfinished stories, the sky stretched wide, unmoved, ancient, as the words pressed into the open, into the space where noise fractures and presence remains. And in that quiet, the first thread of fear curled not among Israel, but beneath the armor of the giant whose roar faltered upon hearing courage, spoken not with arrogance, but with unwavering nearness to the God who weaves strength into the hands of shepherds. The valley floor stretched wide and unbroken, the soil dry beneath the press of ancient sunlight, the grasses bending faint along the edges of stone and earth. And David's footsteps pressed steady into the ground, his stride slow at first, his spirit layered with the hum of presence that threaded through him like the quiet ache of memory, of the hills beyond the noise, of fields where strength blooms in stillness. And across the valley, the giant waited, his shadow curling long across the earth, his frame broad, unmoving, his armor gleaming beneath the pale stretch of sky, his voice layered with brittle defiance as he roared sharp across the open space, his laughter cutting through the hum of silence braided into the land. And yet David's hands did not tremble, his sling coiled loose at his side, the stones resting cool within the pouch upon his hip, his heart braided steady with the memory of lions, of bears, of the quiet, fierce resolve carved into him by days spent walking the hills, tending the flock, trusting the God who threads courage into the small, overlooked corners of the world. And as the soldiers upon the ridge watched, their eyes tangled with disbelief, with the quiet ache of hope rising sharp against their ribs, David's stride quickened, his body pressing forward not with arrogance, not with the brittle roar of pride, but with the steady hum of presence, of obedience, of knowing that deliverance unfolds not through the noise of kings, but through the sacred steps of those who listen, who move when others falter. And with each step, the hum of the hills threaded deeper into him, the soil carrying the ache of unfinished stories, of promises woven into the earth long before giants stood upon it, and the sky pressed wide above, its silence unbroken, its witness steady as David ran, his feet pressing fast across the valley floor, his spirit braided with the courage that blooms in stillness, his eyes fixed upon the warrior who believed size alone shapes history. And though the giant's voice cracked sharp, though his laughter fractured the air, David's breath did not falter, his pace did not break, for the God who weaves courage into shepherds walked with him, unshaken, unseen, steady as the stones pressed small in his hand, and the valley, ancient and wide, carried the sound of his running, the quiet defiance of footsteps that remember strength is not measured by height or roar, but by presence, by the God who speaks beneath the noise, who moves when fear silences men. And with each stride, the ground carried him closer, not to pride, not to spectacle, but to the quiet unfolding of courage written long before kings crowned themselves in fear. The giant's shadow stretched brittle across the valley floor, his frame looming tall beneath the pale weight of morning light, his armor gleaming with the pride of battles won, of men silenced by fear, of voices fractured beneath the brittle roar of arrogance that believes strength is measured by size, by sound, by the clatter of weapons upon polished ground. And yet, as David pressed forward, his feet steady upon the soil, his sling coiled easy in his hand, the cool surface of the stone pressed familiar into his palm, his spirit hummed not with noise, but with the quiet, unyielding ache of presence threaded through his bones. The memory of hills where lions crept close beneath the dark, where bears stalked low among the flock, where courage bloomed not through spectacle, but through the steady hum of trust, of the God who shapes strength in silence, who threads deliverance through small, overlooked things the world dismisses. And now, as the soldiers pressed their breath sharp into their chests, as the valley held itself still beneath the weight of unfinished stories, as the wide sky arched high, ancient and unmoved, David lifted his hand, the stone resting cool, unmeasured by the standards of men, yet braided with the quiet hum of presence, with the fierce knowing that the God who speaks beneath the noise threads power into what fits easily within the curve of a hand. And the sling turned, the leather curling through the air with practiced ease, with the rhythm of fields beyond the roar of armies, and the stone loosed, small, steady, unnoticed by many, yet its flight carried the hum of courage shaped not by pride, but by the quiet ache of faith, of the God who never leaves, never forgets, never measures victory by the brittle scaffolding of size, of noise. And as the stone cut clean through the space between them, as it pressed sharp into the giant's brow, the sound of its impact cracked through the valley, not with thunder, not with the roar of rebellion, but with the quiet, steady unraveling of pride, of arrogance collapsing beneath the weight of overlooked things, of faith anchored deeper than fear. And Goliath's body faltered, his frame staggering, his roar fracturing into silence as he pressed forward, collapsing heavy upon the soil that hummed still with the ache of presence, with the knowing that small things, woven with the God who weaves strength into shepherds, carry power beyond what men believe. The valley pressed still beneath the stretch of afternoon light, the wide floor of earth holding its breath as the impossible unraveled, as the brittle roar of pride collapsed into the quiet hum of presence, threaded steady through the land. And David stood unmoving, his feet pressed firm into the soil, the sling now loose against his hand, the stones cool within the pouch at his side, his heart layered with the quiet ache of memory, of hills beyond the noise, of lions pressed too close to the flock, of the God who speaks not in thunder, but in the hush of forgotten fields, in the ache of hands shaped by tending, by trusting, by the slow, sacred work of courage blooming beyond the roar. And across the valley, the giant faltered, his frame staggering beneath the impossible ache of pride undone, his armor gleaming faint beneath the weight of the wide sky that arched high above, unmoved, ancient, steady, watching as strength measured by noise fractured beneath the hum of overlooked things, the quiet power braided into small stones loosed from a shepherd's hand. And Goliath's shadow curled long upon the ground, the soil humming still with the ache of unfinished stories, the echo of promises whispered to the land long before armies rose, before kings crowned themselves with fear, before men believed noise could shape eternity. And now the giant's knees buckled, his body collapsing heavy upon the soil, his voice fractured, his breath catching sharp before unraveling into stillness. And the valley watched, the hills steady, the earth unmoving as roar met stillness and fell beneath it. And David's spirit did not falter, his chest pressed full with the hum of presence, with the quiet knowing that deliverance often blooms when no one watches, when the world forgets where courage grows. And the soldiers upon the ridge pressed trembling hands to their weapons, their eyes wide, their disbelief sharp upon their faces as the impossible unfolded, as a boy shaped by the hills, by the steady ache of tending, by the God who threads courage into small hearts, stood victorious not with noise, but with nearness, with faith that blooms where the world forgets to look, and the sky held witness, ancient and unbroken, as the giant's body lay still, his pride fractured, his voice silenced by the power of a small thing carried upon the hum of presence. And though the valley trembled beneath the awe of it, David remained steady, his spirit unburdened by the roar now unraveling, his heart anchored in the God who never leaves, who never forgets, who speaks when kings fall silent. The valley pressed silent in the aftermath. The wide floor of earth stretched still beneath the sun. The grasses bent low beneath the ache of unfinished stories. The soil humming quiet beneath the weight of pride unraveled. And David's footsteps carried him steady across the ground, his heart braided with the hum of presence, his sling loose at his side, the stones cool within the pouch that now hung forgotten against his hip. For the moment had shifted, the fracture of arrogance collapsing into the quiet hum of a deliverance, whispered unseen through the soil, through the spaces the world overlooked, and the giant's body lay still upon the valley floor, his frame broad, unmoving, his shadow fractured beneath him, his roar silenced not by louder noise, but by the quiet ache of presence threaded through small hands, through the steady hum of the God who speaks beneath the brittle scaffolding of pride. And the soldiers stood frozen upon the ridge, their breath tangled sharp within their chests, their eyes wide upon the impossible now unraveling before them, the disbelief pressing heavy into their ribs as the line that once divided fear from courage wavered, unraveled, shifted like the slow current of water threading unseen through the cracks in stone. And David moved forward, his spirit anchored in the memory of hills, of the steady ache of tending sheep, of the presence braided into him not by spectacle, but by the fierce quiet of the God who weaves strength through the small, through the unseen, and his hand pressed to the fallen giant's sword, the weight of it unfamiliar, heavy with the brittle pride of battles fought upon the scaffolding of arrogance. And as he lifted it, as the steel caught the sun, the valley trembled not with noise, but with the quiet ache of power unmasked, of strength revealed not in size, but in presence, in faith that threads victory through the hands the world overlooks. And the line shifted, the pride of the Philistines fracturing as fear unraveled sharp within them, as their confidence collapsed beneath the silence, beneath the impossible hum of courage braided into a shepherd's breath. And for the first time, the fear ran the other way, threading like smoke through their camp, unraveling their formation, their voices cracking sharp with disbelief, with the unraveling of pride. And the soldiers of Israel watched as the tide turned, as the impossible became real, not through roar, but through quiet hands anchored to the God who never leaves. And though the ground still hummed with the ache of unfinished stories, the presence braided steady through the soil remained, unbroken, unmoved, threading courage now into those who once faltered. And the fear, the brittle pride of the enemy, ran the other way, undone by the quiet hum of a small, unyielding thing, loosed by faith, carried upon the wind, anchored to presence that never fails. The valley still hummed beneath the wide stretch of sky, the soil pressed quiet beneath the echo of fear unraveling across the Philistine line, their voices cracking with the ache of disbelief as their pride fractured, as the weight of arrogance collapsed beneath the impossible hum of presence braided through small hands, through the steady, quiet defiance of one who did not chase the roar, who did not seek the throne. And David's footsteps pressed firm into the earth, his sling hanging loose at his side, the stones cool and forgotten now in the hush that lingered across the field. And the soldiers of Israel stood frozen upon the ridge, their eyes wide, their breath caught in their chests, their spirits tangled between disbelief and the quiet ache of hope threading sharp through their bones. For they had seen the impossible unravel, had watched the giant fall, not by sword, not by spectacle, but by the unmeasured hand of a shepherd who carried presence rather than pride, courage rather than clamour. And across the valley, the Philistines fled, their formation unravelling, their voices sharp with terror braided into the brittle edges of pride undone. And Israel pressed forward, their spirits catching fire beneath the ache of victory, unfolding not through the noise of kings, but through the quiet, fierce hum of deliverance, woven into the overlooked, into the forgotten, into the boy shaped by fields, by lions, by the God who threads strength into what the world forgets to name as worthy. And David did not linger in the roar of the crowd, did not press his hands upon the brittle scaffolding of recognition, his heart unburdened by the ache of seeking thrones, his spirit steady with the hum of presence braided deep from years spent walking hills far from the roar of men. And though his name would echo across Israel, whispered sharp upon the tongues of those who marveled at the impossible, at the giant fallen beneath quiet hands, his steps remained unchased by the weight of crowns, his eyes tracing the hills beyond the noise, the soil humming still with unfinished stories, with the quiet ache of presence never leaving, never fracturing, never woven through the noise of pride, but anchored steady in the fields, in the forgotten spaces where strength blooms, where the God who weaves deliverance speaks loudest in silence. And the shepherd walked forward, unchained by the roar, unmoved by the fragile scaffolding of thrones he never asked for, his heart braided only with the hum of the hills and the God who threads courage into the quiet, unseen spaces of the world. The valley stretched wide behind him, the hum of unfinished stories pressed into the soil, the grasses bending faint beneath the hush that lingered after the roar had fractured, after the brittle edges of pride had unraveled beneath the quiet hum of presence braided steady through small hands, through the overlooked, through the forgotten spaces of the world, where strength often blooms unseen. And David's footsteps carried him away from the noise, away from the brittle scaffolding of recognition, from the tangled whispers of soldiers marveling sharp at the impossible, their voices layered with awe, with disbelief, with the ache of hope pressed new into their bones. Yet David's heart did not tether itself to their noise. His spirit remained unburdened by the fragile ache of crowns. His sling hung loose at his side. The stones forgotten now, the memory of victory anchored deep not upon thrones, but beneath the hum of soil carried back to the hills. And the earth beneath him whispered still, the fields calling quiet, the steady ache of tending, of guiding sheep beneath skies unbroken by kings, unfractured by the roar of men. And though his name unraveled now across the camps, across Israel, whispered sharp upon tongues tangled with both reverence and rumour, David walked steady, his feet pressing into the paths carved by forgotten shepherds, by those who never sought the roar, who never chased the brittle crown of power, but listened still for the presence braided through wind curling soft along the ridges, through the hum of God threading courage into small, quiet hearts. And the hills rose before him, ancient, unmoved, their soils soaked with stories far older than kings, their grasses bending low beneath the hush of memory. And as he returned to the flock, to the steady ache of fields layered with silence, his spirit anchored not by pride, not by victory measured by noise, but by the presence that never leaves, by the God who shapes strength through the overlooked, who threads courage not for thrones, but for the spaces where the world forgets to name the soil sacred. And David knelt beside the stream, his hands pressing into the cool water, his breath steady beneath the hum of the hills, his heart carrying back with him the quiet ache of a story that does not end upon the battlefield, but blooms again in the forgotten fields, in the hush of small things braided with presence. The hills arched wide before him, ancient and unmoving, their ridges curled soft against the press of evening light, the soil humming quiet beneath his footsteps as David returned to the forgotten paths, to the steady ache of fields untouched by the roar of kings. And though the valley lay behind him now, though the brittle pride of giants had fractured beneath the hum of presence, the weight of story threaded sharp around him, unseen but near, braided not by his own seeking, but by the voices that now carried his name across Israel, their words tangled with awe, with disbelief, with the ache of men desperate to wrap noise around the impossible, to shape victory into something loud, something measured by crowns, by thrones, by the brittle scaffolding of pride. But David's spirit pressed steady, unburdened by the noise unraveling behind him, his sling hanging loose at his side, the stones cool within the pouch forgotten now, the ache of presence braided deep into his bones. And as the soldiers whispered sharp of giants fallen, of kingdoms shifted, of battles won by hands small and unmeasured, David's heart carried only the quiet hum of the God who threads courage through the overlooked, who shapes strength not for thrones, but for the hush of fields where sheep graze beneath skies unmoved by men, by armies, by the fragile roar of those who believe stories belong only to the loud. And the hills received him once more, their soil pressed soft beneath his feet, their grasses bending faint as the sun folded low upon the horizon. And though his name unraveled now across villages, across cities, across the brittle pride of kings who watched from thrones uncertain how to hold the weight of quiet victory, David pressed forward, his breath braided with the ache of the fields, his spirit unshaken by the echo of men remembering him not for the presence that steadied him, not for the quiet ache of trust that carried him across the valley floor, but for the noise their own stories demanded. And yet the God who speaks beneath the roar remained, unseen but near, threading courage still into the small, into the overlooked, into the fields forgotten by those too loud to listen. And though the world would twist his story into spectacle, into crowns chased upon brittle scaffolding, David's heart stayed rooted in the soil, in the quiet, in the presence of a God who never weaves courage for noise alone. The hills arched wide upon the horizon, ancient and steady, their ridges pressed soft against the hush of twilight, the grasses bending faint beneath the slow breath of evening curling across the land. And David's footsteps carried him quiet, his spirit braided steady with the hum of presence threaded deep into his bones, the ache of fields lingering beneath his soles, the whisper of forgotten stories pressing through the soil as the valley lay far behind him now, its brittle roar silenced, its pride fractured beneath the quiet hum of courage, woven not through noise, but through small, overlooked things shaped steady by the God weaves strength into hands the world dismisses. And though the soldiers' voices tangled sharp behind him, layered with disbelief, with awe, with the ache of stories twisted already by the noise of men, David's heart remained unburdened, his sling forgotten at his side, the stones resting quiet within the pouch, the weight of them carried now not by need, but by memory, by the steady ache of presence that never faltered. And the valley whispered still of giants fallen, of pride undone by the hum of deliverance braided through the soil, through the wind, through the small steps of those who listen, who trust, who stand not upon thrones, but upon the unmeasured earth, and the hills hummed ancient witnesses to a story the world could not yet carry well, their soils soaked with the ache of promises unspoken, of strength unraveled not through crowns, but through the quiet ache of courage outliving the brittle roar of kings, of giants, of armies too loud to hear the hum of presence shaping the world beneath them. And though David's name threaded now across Israel, whispered sharp upon tongues, desperate to claim him for noise, for titles, for the fragile scaffolding of pride, his steps remained steady, anchored not to recognition, but to the soil, to the hush, to the quiet ache of the God who never weaves stories for noise alone, who threads courage through the small, the forgotten, the ones who carry deliverance not upon thrones, but beneath the hum of overlooked fields. And as the last light pressed faint across the ridges, as the sky stretched wide and unmoving above him, the echo of courage lingered, outliving giants, outliving noise, braided now into the soil, into the hush of a world still learning where strength grows, where presence remains, where the God of forgotten fields weaves stories the world cannot yet name as holy.